All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone attending DelphiCon and this webinar in particular, which is the webinar about a thriller experience that happened to us in October of this year. And while telling you this thriller experience, this is what I think you will learn during this webinar, and that is to build a TMS web core based progressive web application client from the Delphi IDE, and this backed by a TMS XData REST API backend, also of course created with Delphi. Welcome everyone, and let me tell you where it all started. It started on October the 14th, as you can see from this email, October the 14th at 16:24 in the late afternoon. As such, we received an email from Atanas Popov, who is the general manager of Embarcadero, and Atanas was asking us if we could create an application, a web application, an application for running a contest for Halloween pictures, where previously this contest was run on a regular basis every year, with just exchanging Halloween pictures by email. The idea was for this year to organize this in a little bit a better way, a more professional way, via an app. And as such, Atanas sent us this email Thursday, October 14, with these few requirements for this application, and of course asking if we could do something like that. When receiving this email, I replied it with a couple of questions. I actually had 3 questions that immediately came up when seeing this email. First question was, okay, what database does this application have to use? What backend technology, backend server do we need to use for this application? And finally, maybe the most important question was, when does this application have to be ready? And an hour later or so, Atanas answered this email saying that, okay, with respect to database, take whatever you want, no ID. With respect to backend server or technology, same answer, take whatever you want, no ID. And with respect to the question, when does this have to be ready? The answer was next week, being Thursday, October 21. And on October 21, the application had to go live. So basically, October 14, an ID that had to be built from scratch and had to go live on October 21. Reflecting on this, and of course realizing that there was not much time for reflection, I first of all consulted with my colleague Wagner Landgraf, who is responsible for and manages the TMS XData product at TMS. TMS XData that is designed to create REST API backends, what he thought about this idea, if this was realistic and feasible at all to create such an application in such a short time span. And the answer was that maybe it was possible, but of course it would be quite a bit of pressure, first of all, and also it would require that we reorganize our regular schedule of development and planned work, etc. So it was not trivial at all to suddenly drop all the other work and start working on this challenge, this Halloween contest application. And so we both decided on Thursday night to sleep one night over it, to check a few conditions with the Atanas, and decide on Friday morning. On Thursday night, we received a confirmation of a few things we checked with the Atanas, and on Friday morning, we finally decided to accept this challenge and go for it. And so Friday morning, our Thriller experience really got started. And the first thing we did was translating the requirements that were expressed in that initial email on October 14th to the requirements that we saw for this Halloween contest application. So from the original requirements, we made up a list of things to do. First of all, it should be possible to submit pictures via web application, and along with these pictures, also send or include a title and a description. It should be possible to see a list of all the pictures that were submitted by everyone using the application. There was no login requirement, so no real authorization process, but the identification of users who submitted the pictures had to be done by using the IP address of the user. And it should be possible to vote on pictures submitted by other people. And also here, the IP address was used to control who could vote on what picture and to count the number of votes on pictures. And finally, the requirement was that there is an administration page accessible only to an admin, and allow from there to delete inappropriate pictures, just in case someone abused this application and sent in inappropriate pictures. It should, of course, be possible to delete these pictures. Along the way, along the development that started on Friday morning, a few extra requirements came along, as is typical in a software development process. And here is a list of requirements that we figured out along the way. First of all was the requirement that it should be possible to either select an existing picture from the local file system or to use the camera or cameras connected to a device to take the picture live and then submit this picture. When talking about using the device camera, next requirement came up. That is, of course, some devices have multiple cameras, and then it is important to allow the user to select which camera connected to the device to use for taking the picture and then submitting the picture. Another requirement that came up was controlling the client-side picture size, just in case someone would pick a picture from the local file system, for example, that was huge, like 8 megabytes these days for a picture is not an exception when using a high resolution camera. And of course, sending these pictures that have a really high size was not really desirable. So the idea was to reduce the picture size already at client side in case someone had picked an image of a really considerable size. And a final requirement that came up was the idea to also share the pictures that someone submitted with, for example, share the link with other users via social media, via email, etc. So just to invite other people that they can participate in the voting. Putting all these requirements together resulted in an application with 5 forms. And here is going over all of the forms that we created and having a look at how this was technically achieved. First, and the most important page, is the main screen, the screen that you enter when you open the application, which is the screen to submit pictures. And from here you can see in the middle of the screen that there is the possibility to choose a file from the local file system. And at the same time, we allow that someone using it from a desktop operating system can drag files in this area. And by dragging the file, this is the file that will be submitted to the app. And of course, this is for submitting images. So the picture format needs to be set to picture file format. The application, it was desirable, of course, that the application could run from a mobile device as well as from a desktop device, so that immediately brings in the importance of using a responsible design, a design that adapts to the screen size. And as you can see here, this implicates that on a mobile device there is a hamburger menu, because there is not sufficient space to put all the items immediately visible in the header. So when you click on the hamburger menu icon, the items pop up. When you're running on a desktop screen, sufficiently wide screen, then all the menu items are visible immediately at the top of the screen. You can also see the application icon in the top left corner. And very important here is at number 4 is the progressive web application icon. So this is an icon that shows up in your browser, in your desktop browser, here Chrome in this case. When your application meets all the requirements specified by Google, for example, to determine if your app is really considered or treated as a progressive web application. With progressive web applications, we mean that these applications meet a certain set of conditions. And one of the conditions is that it's using a responsive design. Another condition is that this application does all the needed things to run offline, so that you can also start the application immediately offline. Our application built here with TMS Web Core satisfies all the requirements of a progressive web application, and as such this icon appears in the address bar. When you run this from a mobile device, on an Android, it will show you a pop-up that invites you to add this application to the home screen of your smartphone. That means that an icon will appear on the home screen of your smartphone, and that you can start the application directly from this icon. And when you start the application from this icon, that the application runs full screen without an address bar, and that you can actually no longer visually see the difference between a native installed application and this progressive web application. The same applies for iOS, iPhone and iPad. Only small and subtle difference is that the possibility to add this application, to install it on your smartphone or tablet, that this is offered when you click the share icon in the bottom of the screen. The second screen is the screen that shows after a picture was submitted, and this is the screen you are looking at here. So basically it shows you the picture itself, the title, the description, the name of who sent it, and the thing I wanted to draw your attention to here was the share button. So in the rectangle, the red rectangle, you can see this share button. And when this share button is clicked, you see the share sheet. And the share sheet is visible on the right screen capture. The share sheet that you can see is the one that shows when you click this from Chrome, from the Chrome browser. When you click the share button from an Android device or an iOS device, you will see the iOS specific or Android specific share sheet. And in the share sheet, you see the icons of all applications that have registered for sharing, in this case, in this particular case, in sharing a link, a URL to your submission. And so as you can see, you can share this to the clipboard. When you have this on a smartphone, you will be able to share this with, for example, if you have installed Twitter or Facebook, these kind of applications all allow you to share this URL with. And let's have a look then at the third screen, which is the screen that shows all submissions. And you can scroll from top to bottom all the pictures that others have submitted. And here you can see at position 1, which is the pumpkin, and this is what we have used as an like icon. So if you see a submission, the pumpkin is standard white. When you click it, it turns orange, meaning that you liked this particular picture, and it shows you also the number of votes for this picture. The share button is also visible here on this list screen. And this is using a continuous scroll control that is actually a built-in control that is part of the TMS Web Core framework. What is a continuous scroll list control? It is a control that loads the items, and the items here are the pictures together with title, description, and name. It loads these items on demand, as the user is scrolling through the list. That has a huge benefit or advantage, that it will only load the visible items. So when you open up the screen the first time, this means that it will request from the server only the minimal needed amount of items, and only as the user scrolls down through the list, it will request additional entries from the server. So this of course benefits the load on the server as the user is using this control to scroll through items. And on the right side, you can see in the header some additional options, which are to sort the items by timestamp of submission, sort by the name of who submitted it, and finally also when you click on the pumpkin, to sort up or down on the number of votes on these pictures. And then the final screen is the administration page, which is the page from where someone can delete pictures, inappropriate content. And what you can see here is that this is using basic authentication. So obviously, in order to delete a picture, you need to enter a username and a password that is passed along with the requests to delete an image to the server. The server will validate this username and password, and when validated, will perform deleting such a picture. The button from where to delete the picture is the trash can, and we have used the same logic actually as we have on the page where you can view the submissions, where you can vote on a submission via the pumpkin image. Here the trash can will perform the delete of a picture. What you can also see or noticeable here is that this specific administration page is normally not accessible to users. You need to specifically start this admin page from an URL, and that is by passing a request parameter, and then this particular page will immediately start for the admin user. So, of course, the app went live on October 21, and you can see also now here and now this application live when you go to the URL https://tmssoftware.com/Radoween. So I invite you to visit this application right here, right now, and you can even participate this evening. It will be very cool to see your submissions while you are attending this webinar here at DelphiCon. And let's exchange pictures. Let's see how it works from a desktop device, from a mobile device, from every device actually. And it will be fun to exchange our pictures. Actually, to make this experience fun, I will make a picture of myself organizing this or doing this webinar. So you will actually, I will make a picture of the laptop from where the webinar is run. And that's a proof that this here is all happening live. And let me enter the information, the title, and then you will be able to see if you visit that link. You will be able to see live from where I'm doing this session. Filling in some details, and then of course I can submit it. I need to select the country. Also, you can also see and experience the validation that is being done. And so this picture has been submitted right now. And so I invite you to go and see this particular submission where you can see the laptop in my home office from where this webinar is happening. Additional nice thing this evening or this webinar is that the full source code, both the client side and server side of this application can be retrieved via this GitHub repository. So move over to this repository and download the source code of both the client and the server application. So now we are going to dive into the architecture of this application, both client side and server side, and see how this was created in less than 5 working days. This is when you open the project from your Delphi IDE. This is the project that you will see in the IDE. And I have used some colors to indicate what the different pieces are here in this web client application. In green, you can see the form files. In orange, you can see the files that make up the icon for your application, the icon that will go onto your mobile device home screen when you install it. You can see 3 versions of this icon here, 3 versions that are used depending on the resolution of your smartphone or mobile device. In pink, you can see 2 files, the manifest.json file and the serverswork.js file. And these files are essential for making your web client application a progressive web application. And this is these are the files that determine that your application can be installed on your device. This contains the information for instructing your browser how to install the application on your device. A couple of folders we have in light blue, which is the CSS, the IMG, and the GS folder. This is folders that contain files for the CSS of your application, some images that were used, and JavaScript libraries. Here in particular, we have also used the Bootstrap library, that allows us to create a responsive web application. If we have a look for the server side, here you can see the Swagger UI for the REST API backend server that was created with TMS XData. And here you can see via the Swagger UI the REST API backends, the endpoints. And here you see, quite simple, the entries for adding a submission, add entry, doing a vote, the add vote, which was actually added during the process, but finally not longer used as we replaced it with the last entry, which is the toggle vote endpoint. So add vote is not really used anymore, but was used during the development process. Delete entry is the endpoint for the admins to delete some submission. Get entries is an endpoint for retrieving submissions and retrieving these page by page with a specific number of items you can specify to request. The get picture endpoint is the endpoint that returns just the picture from a particular submission, and the entries endpoint with entry ID you can add is the endpoint that returns all information for one specific submission that was done by the ID of this submission, which is the entry ID. Now let's go back to the source code of the web client application, and let's begin with the startup of this web client application. Here you can see the source code for the project DPR file, and so this is the code that gets executed as the application is started. You can see that it is quite similar to a VCL application, with the exception here that we are using the URL query parameters to determine what exact form will be launched when the application starts. So you can see that if the query parameter results is used, we immediately launch the form from where the submission list is shown. When the URL has the query parameter admin, this starts the admin form, and the admin form is the form from where entries can be deleted. When the query URL query parameter includes the ID, that means that it shows the form with just one particular entry, the entry that matches the ID that is passed on to this URL request parameter. And finally, when no query parameters are specified on the URL, it launches the standard submission form, which is the T form submit. Let's maybe first have a look at our Delphi IDE, and I will open up this project from my IDE. So here you can see in the project manager the files that we talked about. And let's maybe first launch this application to have a look at what exactly is being produced when we launch this application. So I will navigate now to the form where the application code is located. So here is the folder where all files making up the project are located. Here you can already see the application that was launched from the IDE. I will close it for now, and we will have a look at the folder where all the files were created for launching this application. So as you can see here, This is the result of compiling here today during this live webinar. And so you can see that the main JavaScript file, the JavaScript file that makes up the entire client application, is here, and it is approximately half a megabyte. And here is the HTML file from where your application is launched. And other files are the HTML file for each form in this application. We also see here that we are including the Bootstrap files, and these Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript file is used for creating the responsive design. Okay, let's have a look now at our first form, which is the submit picture form. I'm opening the form now from the IDE. Okay, and here you can see the form. The first thing that we notice when opening this form is that this totally does not resemble how the application looks at runtime when I run it. So let's run it again from the IDE. And here it is. So here you actually see the form that corresponds to what we have here in the IDE. Why is it so different? It is so different because we are using an HTML template here for this form, and where the controls on the form are actually only used for making up the UI control logic, and all the design layout is done via HTML. When we inspect the HTML file that is associated with this form, here we can do this from the IDE. Here you can see the entire HTML that makes up the form design. Now, the question is, when we have a control like, for example, this web edit control, which is called name edit, and this is the edit control that will capture the name of someone submitting a picture. How does this relate to when we inspect here in the browser? How does this connect or relate to this name entry field in the form itself and the application? That is done via the element ID. And let's have a look at the property. Here you can see the element ID property of the edit control that is set to name input elements. You can see here a whole list of all possible IDs, and these are the IDs that are found in this HTML file, name input element. When I look this up into the HTML file, here you can see that there is an HTML input element. And this element has some Bootstrap style, and it has this ID, which is the name input element. And it is via this ID that it is uniquely connected to the web edit control on this form. And that means that in this form, in this web UI control logic, we can just refer to our name edit control, use its text property, its onChange event, etc., and just deal with it this way, and it will all be reflected on the real HTML element in our HTML template. Let's have a look at one critical ID, which is a critical thing is to submit an entry, to submit the picture and the title description that goes along with it. And this is done via doing an HTTP request to the XData backend server. And performing this HTTP request is done via an HTTP request component. And you can actually see this component here on the form. When we have a look at all the, well, actually it is created from submitting, when we are clicking the form submit button, here you can see, where is it, form submit. Okay, here you can see that we actually create the HTTP request component, and we will perform an HTTP post command to submit an entry. Here we set the command from this HTTP request to post, and here we specify that what we will submit is a JSON object. We specify the URL, the endpoint URL, which will be the add entry endpoint. And here we generate the JSON that will be submitted. And when this is done, the actual HTTP request is happening here. Request.perform is what performs the HTTP request. And some interesting thing here is the await command. In a web browser, in a web client applications, all the HTTP requests, these are executed in an asynchronous way. That means that executing this request will not block any code at all, will not block your UI. It will keep the UI responsive while it is performing this request. So this is an essential behavior inside a web browser, that HTTP requests are performed asynchronous. That means that when we execute this request, we will not immediately have the response back. And that makes it somewhat complicated, as we do not have the response immediately back, to write our code still in a sequential way to deal with the response itself. And that's why in the web browser world, this concept of promises and await was invented. And here we actually wait for this asynchronous response of the execution of this HTTP request, and the result of this response will be an XML HTTP request class, and this is captured via this response object. So nothing in this code will be blocking, but still the code is kept here and will not move to this line of code until the HTTP request has been performed. When it has been performed, we get this result into the response variable, local variable, and there we can perform a simple check if this request was successful or not. If it was successful, the response will be HTTP code 200. And when we receive the response, what we basically do is parse the JSON that is returned from the server. This is the response we get from the server. It is parsed as JSON text. And what we do is extract the value from it, and the value will be the ID of the new entry that was created, that was submitted. When we have this new entry, what we do is create a new form in our web client application, and that form will show the entry that was submitted. Let's maybe have a look at the JSON object that was created to perform this request. And this is where you can see it here. We get the name from the user, from the web edit control that is used for that. We get it also for the description input control, where you enter the company, the email address, the description you can see here, the country combo box. And so all this is put together into a JSON object. And what we also add, of course, is the image. The image here, when we want to send it via an HTTP request to the backend, the image will be converted into a base64 encoded string. We need to submit text anyway to the backend, So that's why this binary picture data is converted to a base64 string. And here you can see the code that detects if the size of this picture as a base64 string is larger than 1 megabyte or not. If it's larger than 1 megabyte, what we do is actually resize this picture, convert it again to a base64 string, and then it is fine to include it here in the JSON object. This is where it happens, and submit it. This functionality to resize the image is actually built into the web image control. So if we inspect the form designers, here you can see the web image control. This is where your picture you take from the local file system or that you take with the camera, where it will be shown. And this control has this built-in feature to resize your image. So this was the preview and the resizing, and let's have a look now at the page in the application that will show all the submissions. And maybe we can first have a look at the Delphi form created for that, which is the overview form. Here it is. Here you can see the same concept. It does not resemble at all how it looks like in the browser. Let's maybe take the browser here and do a view submissions. And here we can see actually what you have already submitted during this session, which is actually very cool to see. I see that David I is even live here at DelphiCon, which is fantastic. So we can see all these entries live. This is the form that we can see here in the Delphi IDE. And we can see here buttons that are also mapped onto HTML elements. So the same story goes here for this submission form, where this is the HTML that makes up the form. And these buttons are mapped onto HTML elements all via the element ID property. And as you can see, this is the sort up and down button, the about button, etc. But the core part of this form is the web continuous scroll control. And this is a control part of TMS Web Core that has been specifically designed for this kind of purpose, where you dynamically load content as you scroll through the list. And essential here in this control are two events, which is the onFetch next page. Let's have a look at the implementation of the onFetch next page event handler. This event is triggered whenever the continuous scroll control needs extra data for displaying. So as the user, either in an initial view or as the user scrolls through the list, as you scroll, it will trigger this event asking, please give me the next URL I should request the next items from. And it will pass along the parameters, what the page number and the page size. So the amount of items requested and the page number of the new page of items it will want for this list. When we look at the implementation of the get entries URL, which is a function that basically just returns the URL to the endpoint of the XData backend, you can see here that it calls the get entries API endpoint and passes along as request parameters the sort order, and then of course the page number and the page size, how many items per page. So the continuous scroll list control does all this by itself as it needs items. It just asks the application for the next URL, and it will then perform the HTTP request to this URL, and fetch the items returned, is expected to be returned as a JSON array. It will fetch these items, and it will construct items for the continuous scroll control for each item or JSON object in this JSON array. And this is the code that is executed when every item for each JSON object in the JSON array is created. But first of all, let's have a look at what the continuous scroll control will do automatically based on an HTML template that is specified for the control. So here you can see the property web continuous scroll item template, and you can see the HTML that is specified for this template. That means that this template will be applied for every item created, and you can see here this %ID%, or also this %votes %, message number, %language, etc., %description %. So what the continuous scroll control does is use this HTML and merge this with the information it extracts from the JSON object in the JSON array that the server will return. And when there is a value with the value name, language, or description, it will replace the value within this HTML template. And this is actually what is responsible for already creating, as you can see here in the browser, for creating an entry like this, including the picture, where the title is, where the name of someone and description of someone who submitted is. And what is happening in addition to that, that is it will create an image control on the fly for this element. And the sole reason for creating this image control here is for associating a click handler with that image. This here is actually the image for the pumpkin. It connects to, and it just handles the event handler for the click with the like click method. When you double click the picture, it will also perform a vote or unvote, and that means that we are just creating another web image control, mapping or binding it to the picture of the item and handling the on double click also via this like click event handler. And here you can see that for this image here that was created, we are on the fly changing the URL for this picture. We change it to pumpkin.svg or pumpkinsmile.svg, which is either the white icon, unvoted icon, or here the orange icon when someone has voted. And finally, we also create a button control that we link to the share image that is in this item, and from there we can also deal with sharing it by handling it via the share click event handler. Let's first have a look at the like click event handler, and this will call the set like with the ID of the submission, and that means also executing an HTTP request for the toggle vote endpoint that you can see here. So it performs an HTTP request, a post to this endpoint, and from there the vote will be toggled. When the response is successful, the status code is 200, then we get from the response the new state whether this submission is voted or not voted, and depending on this new state we will replace the image for the pumpkin with the orange version or the white version. And what we will also do is here fetch the HTML item that shows us the number of votes, and we will add into this HTML element, we will add the number of the new number of votes that were returned from this request. So that is how the continuous scroll control works and how we handle clicking on it. And as we are going closer to the end of this webinar, let's have a quick look at the server side, the backend, the HTTP REST API server. And this is an XData based Windows server. Note that XData can also generate for you from the same code a Linux server, but here in this case we have used a Windows-based XData server that is deployed on an Amazon EC2 server. And here you can see the server, the files on the server, and you can see that we have used a SQLite database for this app. When we have a look at the database model or scheme, it's quite simple. We have one table for all the entries of submission with the basic information that goes along with each entry, and an additional table that counts votes on a specific submission. So here we capture the ID of what someone has voted for and the IP address from where it was voted. And that's actually the only information we keep in the database. XData works together with TMS Aurelius, which is our object relational mapping product. And that means that we can deal with object Pascal objects instead of directly dealing with the underlying database. And here you can see the mapping of the entries table in the SQLite database, the mapping to an object Pascal class that represents an entry. And you can see here the timestamp of creation, for example, the ID, the name, company, etc. The XData server, as you have seen in the Swagger UI, exposes a number of endpoints, and these endpoints actually corresponds to our service that is central in the XData server. And so this is the definition of this service. And you can see public functions: add entry, get entries, get entry, get picture, add vote, toggle vote, delete entry. As you can see, the names that have been used here in the service class in the XData server are actually the same names that the endpoints are using that you can call from the web client application. So when you add new methods here in your XData service, this will automatically become endpoints in your XData server. And let's have a look at one actual implementation of such an endpoint, which is the toggle vote endpoint. Here you can see the code for that. The toggle vote, it has one request parameter, which is the submission ID, entry ID. And what we do here is actually perform a lookup. You can see that this is using Aurelius because we deal with objects and we use something like the TDB vote is the class that represent records in the votes table. And so you can see that we are performing here in code and lookup to see if for this particular ID, the IP address is already there or not. If it's there, what is happening is that the entry is removed because it means it was already voted for, so the toggle vote will unvote that item. If this vote record for this particular IP address was not found, that means let's add some record for this specific IP address and set the entry point. Let's point the entry to this vote, and then add this vote to the votes table. And with that, we come to the conclusion of this webinar, where we had a look at both the client implementation and the server implementation of this Halloween application. And I'm having a look right now if I can see.
I'm here, Bruno,
Okay.
and I can read some of the questions off here.
Okay.
Does this work in XE8 as well?
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
It does, and it's working in 11
to Delphi 11.
I'm sorry, how far back does it go?
XE7.
Okay, great.
Other questions?
For the HTML that's used, is that generated automatically? Did somebody have to write that? How does that work? And what about someone making their own custom components?
The HTML that we created was custom created. So what you can see here, for example, in this submit form, we fully created it ourselves. So WebCore offers you a choice whether you use the design as is on your form, or if the HTML will determine your layout, and then you can specify everything here. As you can see in HTML, you can see that this is heavily Bootstrap based HTML. It uses these specific Bootstrap classes like the collapsed navbar, etc. These are, when you are familiar with Bootstrap, you will notice right away the classes that are used here for making up this particular layout. So it will depend on your preference. Do you prefer building everything directly from the form designer, or maybe you will hand off the job to someone who's familiar with Bootstrap and HTML and graphics design, etc., and then you can integrate what maybe someone else or yourself has been creating.
Okay, so okay. What server platforms can you run on? Can you run on Linux server? Where else can you run?
Windows and Linux are the targets that XData supports. Technically, you can also run it from a Mac, but I believe that most servers are not Mac-based.
Now, I know that some of your stuff works on ARM Linux. Does this also work on ARM Linux?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yes. Via Delphi 11, of course.
That makes me happy.
Yeah.
Let's see. So is the code? Where can people download the code in your slides?
If you navigate to GitHub, I can bring up that slide again where the GitHub link is shown here. So you can navigate to GitHub right now, and all the source code is in this GitHub repository.
Can you there's a chat window there in the control panel. Can you paste those links in the chat window?
Okay, let me grab this link.
It gets so hard to do, especially on mobile devices. It drives me bonkers.
But okay, I copied it, and now let's see where this chat window is.
It's at the bottom of the control panel there.
It's always so small. But I managed. Here it is. You see it?
Yep, I will. So I can put it out to it's sent just to me, but I'll send it to everybody.
Okay.
Excellent. It would be interesting to see what part is running on a web server and what part is running in the browser.
It are actually two different projects. There's the project for the client, the web core client, and this is the project that you see here in my Delphi IDE, okay? And there's also a project that you can find at the GitHub repository, a project that is for the XData server. So you compile the XData server and you put this XE on, well, you can run it locally or you put it on some server, and from there the endpoint is accessible, and then you have the web client application, and this is running directly from the browser and performing the HTTP request to the XData server, from where it fetches the data. Of course, when you start the application and you only see the submission screen where you take the picture, no connection with the server has already been made. It's just the application running and ready to capture. It's only when you first submit a picture of move to the screen where you see the previously submitted pictures that requests to the XData server will be performed to either submit or get these specific entries.
Does the XData server part, someone's asking for clarification, does the XData server actually run on ARM Linux, or is it only the web part that runs on ARM Linux?
I was confused with ARM. ARM is on the Mac, but because it is compiled from the Delphi IDE, so it supports the targets that the Delphi compiler supports.
Okay. Does TMS Web Core work in 10.0 CE Community Edition?
In 10.4 Community Edition, it works, yes.
Fantastic. Does the, let's see, does one request equal one thread? Sorry, I'm running two at the same time here. Is each request got its own thread?
You mean from the XData server?
Yeah, I guess so.
That's a good question. I need to check that with my colleague Wagner. So I suggest to, you can send us an email to be 100% sure and check that off with my colleague Wagner, who is responsible for the XData server.
What components does somebody need if they're like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I need? How do they get started?
Here we have used nothing more than web core for the front end, for the web client application. So this is 100% web core and no other components were used. For the web client application, for the server, we have used XData, so also no other products. So this is Delphi 11 plus web core for the web client and XData for the server part. So with these three things, we created everything shown here during this webinar.
Three things: Delphi, XData, Web Core. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. I was just trying to type it, and I was like, make sure I didn't get something. There is the. Can you do a SAPI with XData? Build in a SAPI component that you can load into IIS or Apache module?
Let me look that up. Yes. Let me look that up. Okay. No. So it's XData on Windows is using HTTP sys. So this is running in an also under IIS, but in a different way from what technically an ISAPI interface is. It's actually HTTP sys is actually a higher performance implementation for running under IIS than an ISAPI DLL is.
Okay. How many requests per minute can the REST server handle?
I think there is no universal answer to this question because it will heavily depend on what your request is actually doing on the server. I give the example of voting. Here you can see, okay, it performs a lookup in the votes table, and then it will toggle a vote, add an entry or not. But for example, the HTTP endpoint that will return one specific picture will send back a lot more data than a toggle vote endpoint. So I think there is no universal answer on the number of requests. It highly depends on what your request is performing server side and what amount of data is involved. I think one additional thing to note, which applies to any REST technology, is that it is stateless, and this means that it is very easy when you are entering or your load is becoming an issue. As the backend, the server is stateless, you can easily duplicate this on multiple servers and have multiple servers handle the load. Scaling is actually very easy with stateless REST endpoints.
Larry's saying that the TMS software site, the making of Radaween, is giving an error message right now. And there's a question if you can use OAuth 2.
Let me have a look. If I can see that there is actually a message. Meanwhile, I will answer your question about OAuth 2. At this moment, you can use it, but at this moment, you will need to develop this yourself, add this functionality yourself. We have XAuth coming up. It's actually in beta. If you are a customer, you can already access that beta. And with XAuth, this implements for you automatically an OAuth 2 authentication authorization workflow. So XAuth is coming to address that automatically for you. While XAuth is not yet released, you will need to add this manually to your application. I checked right now, but I see from here that the application is live.
If you want to add an event code, for example, on exit to an edit component, how do you do that? Do you need to use JavaScript here? How is this compared to .NET Web Forms?
No JavaScript required. So suppose we have here our submit form. And I have here a web edit that is used for editing the name of the submission. I have here the on-exit event, and I can just add, I could do some validation, like for example, if name edit dot text equals empty, so no name was specified, I do something like please set a name. So this is the on-exit event handler for the HTML input element that corresponds to the name edit that is linked to the name edit control, and I can do all the coding for all the events for this particular control directly in Object Pascal language.
Fantastic. I love it. TMS Web Core, is that only available in All Access, or can you get it through other subscriptions?
It's separately available. So,
is it in TMS Business subscription, or is that separate?
It's not part. So it's actually available in two ways. Can you see the screen here? It's available in two ways. Here it's available as a standalone product. You can download it from here. There's a trial version, and it's also part of All Access. And also noteworthy, I think, is that there is an academic version for students. Here from our academic page, you will also find TMS Web Core. So academic
Fantastic.
is there. There is the separate version Web Core standalone, or it's also part of All Access.
Where did I put the questions? I lost the question window. Oh, there it is. It was behind the other window. What version of Bootstrap do you use?
Here in this Radouin app, we have used Bootstrap 5, and we have a slight preference towards Bootstrap 5, as this is a small payload, contrary to Bootstrap 4 that also requires the jQuery payload. Bootstrap 5 does not require jQuery, and that's why we have a preference to use that one. And it's the one that is used in this Radouin app. You can actually see here that this is the payload for Bootstrap. These two files, I think you can see them right now here on my screen.
Yes.
This is the JavaScript and the CSS that was used.
Sorry, I lost the question I was going to ask you next. Oh, if someone was making a new project, if they wanted to start out from scratch, making a new web core project, how would they do that from the IDE?
Oh, that's very simple. So you go to File, New, Other, and here you have TMS Web, where you have the different types of applications, web applications that you can create from TMS Web Core. In this particular case, for the Radouin app, we have chosen the TMS Web Progressive Web Application type. As this, I will generate one right now, and I will not save any change. So now it has created for us an empty one form progressive web application. And so here, from here, you can now start adding your components and start developing your application. So when I add an edit button, the classic example, let's add one more control. And so the classic thing, web listbox.items.add web edit one.text. So everything is Object Pascal, of course, and we are already up and running with this progressive web application. So here we have it, and it's up and running. That's all you need to do to get started, and you have a progressive web application immediately from the Delphi IDE.
All right, great. Well, I need to go ahead and go. We already got the other session running, so thank you for this. If they want more information, if they go to TMS, your website, TMS Software, you have a number of videos up on there as well on your YouTube channel. People can learn more about TMS Web Core. I'm a huge fan, so thank you for putting this together. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for your time, and thanks for having me. And I wish you a great further conference, DelphiCon, with many interesting things to learn for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it so much. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.